The RFNG is supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Consultation and accommodation with First Nations communities is a legal duty under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also emphasizes the importance of free, prior, and informed consent in decision making. So, what does it mean to consult and accommodate from a First Nations perspective? Hello, and welcome to Inherent Rights Informed Voices, a podcast brought to you by the Centre for First Nations Governance and the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. Today, we're going to be exploring Canada's duty to consult and accommodate. My name is Serena Smith, and I'll be your host for today. I was born and raised on Haida Gwaii, my traditional territory going back until time immemorial. I'm also a research assistant for the RFNG project, where I helped with research on consultation with Giuseppe Amatulli. I'm currently studying my Master's of Public Policy at Carleton University. As you've probably heard by now, there's been a lot of pressure to quickly approve major development projects across Canada in response to global economic shocks. And in some regions, First Nations traditional territories are on the line. The conflicting interests that come with consultation and accommodation can be tricky to navigate, so here to unpack how to prioritize First Nations self-governance in decision-making processes are three leaders in the field. Valérie Courtois is the Executive Director, or Ushi Mao, of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and a leader in Indigenous-led conservation stewardship. She's a member of the Innu community of Mashtoyats in Lac Saint Jean. Valérie works to help First Nations care for the land and water while advancing their leadership and helping to secure project funding. Singait La, Valérie. Thank you for joining me.
Kwei, Serena. Very nice to be here with you today.
Well, we know that consultation and accommodation acts through the inherent right to self-governance. I'm wondering, what does it mean or look like to consult and accommodate First Nations? Like, who is usually part of these conversations? And are there any examples of well-done consultation or poor consultation?
Normally what happens in terms of resource development or conservation or kind of any other land use consultations is that there's a letter sent to chief and council, and then the chief and council will delegate someone to respond. That in itself depends on the nature of the capacity of the community or the nation that is being engaged with. And often the burden of consultation can be quite heavy. I hear this all the time. Places like my own community in Mastuyats and Pikwagameet is how we call Lac Saint Jean in our language. It means the first lake. And they may, in any given summer, receive hundreds of requests for consultation on land use, whether that is for cottage use, road changes, or proposed operations in forestry. It really is important for the nation to have really the capacity to engage. This is part of why I work on promoting the role of guardians, because guardians are in many ways that capacity. They do that not only from a community setting, but they can do things like verify their own land use that they've been able to map and kind of overlay the proposals with that mapping. They can go on the land and actually verify and see what sort of impacts such a proposal can have. Often it's not possible to fully respond to all of that pressure for consultation. My preferred context, though, is when the First Nations can assert their own vision for what can happen on the land. So the presence of a land relationship plan, or also known as a land use plan, often is enabling to help ensure that if consultations occur within proposed protected areas or established protected areas, then you can deal with it one way. Or if it's within a land use zone, then you can really start to have almost like a triage effort to make sure that the nature of your responses are enabled by the capacity that you have.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. The role of guardians in like asserting your nation's territory, I guess, or your rights over your territory. And I like the term you use, the land relationship plan rather than land use plan, because it kind of centers people in their relationship to the land rather than just using it.
Yeah, that's a term that was coined by Simca and Giselle Martin from the Clawakwiat Nation, and I've used it ever since. I agree with you, Serena. It's, too often when we think of land use plan, it already presupposes this kind of human use and kind of extractive relationship that often occurs with land. And the land relationship planning does a good job to kind of remind us of the responsibilities and the reciprocity that comes from such a relationship.
Yeah, I think like the role of guardians, it kind of helps conceptualize and assert the stewardship role, because I feel like when consultation is happening, it's like we need to be able to have a part in decision making and really bringing our understanding of the land or waters to the table. Like, because for thousands of years, our people have been passed down this knowledge about the land. And so, like, when I'm at school, I'll tell people, I think Western society has this very, I don't know, metaphysical idea or something of our relationship to the land, where it's like, I kind of get this image of like Pocahontas and the colors of the wind, where there's like, like singing animals and like you can see the wind, different colors flying around. But in reality, it's like there's this knowledge that's passed down for so many generations since time immemorial. And so who knows better than the people of that land, what should be done? So I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the modern kind of imposed governance through the Indian Act is an artificial reality of leadership. Our traditional governance really depended on knowledge and experience in place and being in those places. So caribou, we have a concept in our language that's ushukatik. It means where you will always find caribou. So they have fidelity to certain regions. Well, a chief and council cannot know all of those things at once. It is artificial for that expectation. So when they receive a consultation request or when they receive a proposal, it's actually almost in many ways unfair to expect them to statute on each one of those proposals, because it may be in a zone where their own family does not have strong relationships, but another might. And this is part of why when we promote the role of guardians, this isn't just one person, or the ultimate guardian or watchman programs are ones that have many families represented, that look at the many zones of use and the many kinds of expertise that are required to make such a decision. And those, for us, guardians, by definition, feed into the decision-making process of a community. I am really keen on the Guardians offering when we think about looking at the pressures of land use, because often we'll get isolated requests that are not necessarily in place. It's actually quite new for provinces to ask questions about cumulative effects. And that is the beauty of Indigenous science and what Guardians can bring to the table, because they bring that holistic and full understanding of really what is risk to the landscape and how you minimize that risk. If you have one mine, it's not just the mine proposal, and usually mines have a fairly low footprint, but then there's all kinds of other aspects that are related to that you have to think about if you're an Indigenous person using that landscape. What is the road to extract that mineral gonna do in general to your ability and availability to use that place? Having Guardians that are knowledgeable about both the Indigenous science, but also who are trained in Western science, and is a really great way of ensuring that when we're making decisions that will impact years and generations, like mines or like forestry proposals or other extractive industries, then we can really make sure to minimize risk. Because what we've learned about past projects is that often we do not fully know what those impacts may look like.
Some of the things you're mentioning remind me of the Haida laws that come out of the natural world. So one of them is Ginawa Duchan Gurat Kwagit, which is everything depends on everything else. And you're so right. I feel like that part of Western science is missing. And so, yeah, it just makes me wonder, like, if the cumulative effects model that's come up in government has kind of stemmed from Indigenous knowledge, because I know there's some teams out there in government that are working with nations on cumulative effects and spending years talking to the community and building those relationships so that, you know, when, I don't know, maybe a project is being proposed, there's a deeper understanding of what those impacts could be. Having those Guardians there who understand a certain area is so important, but I've also seen in my community too, like, when something was being proposed and brought to the community, it was so important to have elders there who were able to speak up and be like, oh, actually, you shouldn't build anything in that specific area because of XYZ. And it's like, just, it kind of taught me like the importance of just one person it's like such a wealth of knowledge that we need everyone. And I think it's so tough living in this modern colonial society where nations are being, like, they have so many projects being thrown at them, so many things they have to consult on, and it's just feels so impossible to try and keep up or be like considering all of the effects when they're all being thrown at them. And it's like, I don't know, I attended a economic reconciliation conference recently, and I just kept thinking, like, what about the environment? Like, what about the effects on everything else? And it just seemed entirely missing from the conversation.
Yeah, it's tough because it's, we have some suppositions that are imposed on us because of the colonial system and the fact that we're in a resource-based economy as this country. And so I'll give the example of major projects. Right now we have, a legislation, Bill C-5, that has been enacted by the House that talks about enabling the development and the extraction of new resources. Well, when that arrives at the community, the reaction is, well, the only thing we can do is not necessarily, we can always withdraw our consent and fight the project, but like anything, it's much easier to take energy that's coming at you and channel it as opposed to stopping it. And that's really, really tough. So when we think about major projects, in my sense, it is really important that they be accompanied by some conditions for them to happen, like to enable the presence of guardians, like having impact benefit agreements that put in place forums to discuss long-term environmental effects, like making sure that if there is development in those regions, that the benefits come to the communities. I mean, let's be honest, our standard of living as Indigenous peoples in this country is way lower than the average Canadian. And it's not like we don't deserve a higher standard of living, and we're gonna need to, as nations, think about developing some of those resources. This is a part of the richness, and we also have modern needs and live in a modern wage economy, and do need jobs and do need security and pension plans and all the things that come with being a part of that system. So the question is, what needs to stay to enable these environments and the future generations that are coming at us after us, and who will look back and say, were those good ancestors? Like, I hope the future generations will look back at me and said, that was a person who tried to be a good person every day of their life, and to maintain and flourish in the relationship with place. But also, I want to make sure that I do have a pension plan, and that my future generations are not stuck in the cycles of poverty that many of our members and communities are stuck into. So finding a way of ensuring that we have continued dialogue with the pressures that come at us is really important. And it's not by imposing systems or imposing things that we're going to get there. It's actually by participation and by being a part of those conversations that we're going to arrive to a place where our nations are finally recognized as the nations they are.
Yeah, I think those are super important insights as to how we move forward with reconciliation and with the Building Canada Strong movement under Mark Carney. As consultation evolves, it's important that it's not just a check mark or kind of just something that proponents or government legally have to do, but actually involving Indigenous peoples from the planning stage all the way through the project if it happens. Do you think that, with all that said, that the reforming of consultation or evolving of consultation has made the process of resource development have less conflict? How does consent play into the process?
Well, look, consent is the standard that we should be seeking, and that is a fundamental aspect of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that has been enshrined in not only in federal law but in some provinces, though some provinces have had some opinions about the implementation of that law. We can take British Columbia as a recent example of that. In many ways, our relationship with the colonial government has been one not of creativity, but of obligation. And I think consent can bring us to a place of creativity. It's in our mutual interest to uplift each other as peoples, especially in the kind of the rural, remote regions of this country. More than 80% of the Canadian population lives within 200 miles of the American border. That is where most kind of the population, that is where most of the political power of this country exists. Yet, most of the financing and the sources for our economies are actually not in that region, other than kind of the service industry and all of those kind of things, but they actually come from those rural, remote areas. And because that is an extractive kind of relationship, we can think about communities like Fort St. John or Yellowknife or Fort McMurray or Thompson, Manitoba, or Amos, Quebec, or any of these, Goose Bay, Labrador, where I live. those are communities that in themselves, if it wasn't for those extractive industries, would not be very sustainable as communities, and it kind of locks those regions into that dynamic of extraction. And I think that it would be great for First Nations to be entirely a part of that decision-making framework. And I'm deliberately not using the word integration, because I don't want that participation to simply be dovetailed into a system that exists. What I'm actually proposing is that as peoples, we jointly dream of the future that we want. I think as a country, if we really want to achieve reconciliation, the way to do that is through dialogue, is through joint dreaming, and then putting in place the real things that it will take. It is not okay that mines get put in place and then we have impact benefit agreements, and then our nations have, the lowest paying, kind of lowest opportunity jobs. It is not by cleaning rooms of the miners that we're going to get in a place where our nations are going to thrive. We have to invest in making sure that our peoples are in all of the kind of roles and responsibilities that are involved.
I feel like we all have so much more in common than, any differences we might have, and it could benefit us all to have a stronger relationship and stronger understanding of each other's cultures. If there's anything that you want to leave this interview with.
I enjoy chatting with you, Serena, and I hope that our future generations that are coming up will be able to take the mantle when they're ready, and that they have as many opportunities to think in this way and to dedicate their lives to this as I have, and that they realize that both the privilege and the responsibility that it comes with. And I can't wait to see where the next generations are going to take us.
Oh, for sure. I feel like the youth today have been set up very well by other generations that have really instilled that in us. So thank you so much for joining me today. It was so great talking to you. Asing Dongsul King Goska, Valérie. I'll see you next time.
Thank you very much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Shona Nelson is the band manager of Dowig River First Nation in BC. She has over 20 years of experience in the field and keeps the improvement of her community's governance and administration central in her work. Shona has experience working with all levels of government and industry in consultation, accommodation, and more. And last but not least, Giuseppe Amatulli, who's a postdoctorate fellow with RFNG. His research focuses on the impacts of industrial development on First Nations socioeconomic organizations. Hi everyone, welcome to the show.
Hi there, I'm Shona Nelson from Treaty 8 Territory this morning.
Hi there, I'm Giuseppe Amatulli. The main thing when it comes to consultation and accommodation, at least to me, and based on what I've been learning in the last few years, working with Dowig River First Nation before, and then in the context of my research project, is that consultation and accommodation should be done according to a First Nation perspective, but most often is done according to the government perspective. And so the first big question that I think it is worth exploring in this podcast is, what is consultation and accommodation from a First Nation perspective?
Consultation, accommodation, I mean, those are really like legal terms, and not really like from an Indigenous perspective at all. And I would say, like, in my experience, the foundation for any type of consultation and engagement is the trust and the trust building relationships. with government, consultation accommodation, the term is really legal and performative. And in the First Nation perspective, it's really relational, and the relationship with the land and people and the community. So for my experience working with Doig River, and prior to that with the Treaty 8 Tribal Association, we've been navigating this space because the consultation and accommodation legal frameworks have changed and evolved in the last 20 years. I hate to date myself. I've been in the space for a long time. And so what that looks like, to consult is just basically to gather information and to engage and fact find for a regulator or for an industry. Quite often it's just about checking the box where they identify potential concerns or interests. But from an Indigenous perspective, it's about sharing and having a conversation about why the land is important and why it's important to their identity. And so it's not just about impacts like, say, like a bear den moving, or something like that. It's actually about their well-being and who they are and how they see themselves on the land and their connection to the land and themselves. So there's a real, I don't know if the word would be like, it's not a tension, it's just a different worldview. So when you're coming from a legalistic perspective, legal framework, and basically box checking, I hate to say the term, they're there for that purpose, to get a project over the line or to gather information. But Giuseppe, you'll know, working out in a community like Doig, it's about spending time together and being connected with your community and on the land. So the consultation is different. I mean, we've got the experience working with government and industry on that, but the proponents and the government people that are most successful are the ones that come out on the land and have these long-standing relationships with Doig, when they really get to understand the people and how they interact on the land. And so that's just kind of like high level. There's just a different worldview on what that looks like. And but of course, we always have to go by the law, rule of law, and what that looks like. So the question really is, how do you take the Indigenous perspective? And the other thing is, every community is different, right? So you can't just throw us all under one blanket, as our former chief would have to say, which is really hard for government and industry because they like certainty and ease and they want consistency. But what you would do at the Doig River community could be a lot different than our sister band over at Blueberry or Halfway River First Nation. And I'm just using the Northeast BC Treaty 8 experiences because those are the ones I'm familiar with. And those are treaty nations. But what about those nations that don't have treaty? What does that look like for them and their cultural grounding and how they engage and consult with the Crown or with industry?
Yeah, I think we have been having so many conversations about how to consult with a nation, and it is true that the relationship part is always the most difficult part, because it is difficult to establish relationships and to build the trust, which is a fundamental feature for consulting in a proper way. I would like to ask you about accommodation, because when I was actually doing an interview, he was telling me that, well, consultation is difficult, but there has never been accommodation. No one knows what accommodation really is. And I think it is also important to reflect on the real meaning of accommodation, because this is a bit of a buzzword, right? It's like, okay, consulting and accommodating, but is there real accommodation when First Nations are consulted? And what does that mean?
I've been thinking about that for a long time, actually. It's been on my mind, and there's not a lot of case law even on accommodation, because but there's consultation, there's mitigation, and there's accommodation. And when I think about it, if you're with government or industry, consulting with a First Nation on a proposed project, so mitigation is like, okay, we're going to mitigate the impact of this development on the land by moving this pipeline 50 feet, or like when you think about you're mitigating these impacts, that I look at that as more of that science, technical space. But when we think about accommodating for the loss of the use of the land and the ability to practice their Aboriginal and treaty rights, that's a different space. And we've had to be very creative about that, because typically, like in a project agreement, they'll do an economic accommodation, right? So they might pay the community amount of money for loss of use, as an accommodation, and you would negotiate that with a proponent. But then there's also accommodating, like with providing jobs or opportunities or education. But for us, like when I worked at DOIG, we've really tried to find some creative ways, and how do we include community, and what like I always go back and ask them, like, what's important to you? What's important about this area? What do you want to see happening in there? And if a project was to happen. So there's the technical science mitigation piece, but the accommodation part, there's not a lot of work done on the legal space on that, and so it hasn't really been tested, short of what I understand is like, primarily economic accommodation. But some of my experiences, if we've tried to do other things like building out programs or opportunities for our monitors or our members to get on the land in different spaces, like cultural monitoring, post-construction monitoring, different things like that, where they can still be out there and have a say in how things are managed on the territory. So accommodation, what does that look like? What are you accommodating for? And there's a lot. It's complex, and it's an old space, but it's a new space. But we're still navigating it, and really, the First Nations or the impacted peoples, like on the land, really have to think about that. And it ranges, like, how do you manage it for individuals, like say a trapline holder? What's the accommodation that they're going to look for? And then also, what is the collective looking for, like the community as a whole? And those are the things that First Nation practitioners like myself or my colleagues in the lands offices have to navigate. And so for me, I think it's not about making it easy for the proponent or government. It's about like really identifying what matters to the people. It's not for me to say. It's really about like those members that or community members that have to experience what that accommodation looks like. So it can be a range of things, like in our experience, from economic, it could be contracting, it could be employment, there could be education opportunities. It's about maybe negotiating a long-term relationship agreement, which I've done a lot with in my DOIG space with the proponent. It's like, hey, you can't just be here and do a one and done. You have to be, if you're going to be here, you're going to be here and building a relationship with the community for the long term. So we've done that so that you have these value-added experiences and opportunities, and potentially compensation for the First Nations to manage that loss of use.
How do we reconcile when it comes to really First Nation sovereignty and what is going on also with this new proposal for wind farms, for example, or for anything that is renewable, so green and so depicted as positive, no matter what. It is also important, I think, to have a critical mind when it comes to consultation and accommodation done by proponents who are there to build the next wind farms just because they are using renewable energy. And so my question is, do they do consultation in a better way? Are they able to consult and accommodate in a different way? Or is it basically the same old, just framed in a different way?
It's actually worse right now, and you wouldn't think, like, so the transition to green energy is a good thing, but it's the how they go about it, right? And so in our experience, there's been they've changed legislation where wind tower projects are now going to be regulated through the BC Energy Regulator, which rather than through the BC Environmental Assessment Office, which is more of a robust process, where First Nations actually have a better say and opportunity to consult and engage through the BCEO. And that was a system that worked really well. So in this rush to do this transition, or in British Columbia, they want to electrify oil and gas. So you're not really getting rid of oil and gas, but you're doing new development. These companies, these renewables, they don't have a history with our communities, or it's been pretty limited. So they're coming in thinking, well, hey, this is something that the province supports, it's green, we can just come in and roll out this project and everyone's going to be happy and it's going to be kumbaya. Well, it's not. And I mean, there are landowners that have issues with this, not just Indigenous people. So it's actually been worse, and it's been very chaotic in the last year and a half for our nation to have to deal with renewables. I'm all about green energy and finding better ways to reduce the carbon footprint, absolutely. But that does not mean you have to do poor consultation engagement. And maybe some of these renewable projects, they really need to think about them, where they're being located, who's benefiting, what does it look like. And I hate to use the term cowboy it, but that's what they've been doing. And they need to be more thoughtful in rolling this out and be more collaborative and engaging with the First Nations on what that would be looking like.
Yeah, so thinking about all of the generations that are affected by resource extraction, like growing up on Haida Gwaii on my territory, I know a lot of Indigenous youth who are super passionate about being stewards of the land and kind of like protecting it, or, they have a deep understanding of the land. And I feel like within the policy realm or government realm or consultation and engagement, they can be kind of left out of the conversation. So I'm wondering, like, in your area of the province, are youth brought into engagement at all, or like what's the feel with that?
It's always been the elders in a lot of the communities that kind of rule the school because they have the knowledge, right? As we should respect and honor them, right? But we're also thinking about 7 generations, and what is a place for the young people who will be living with these impacts. And so different communities do different things. We do like our elders monitor program. So we engage youth to go out with the elders on monitoring jobs and working together and learn. So we want to facilitate that intergenerational transmission of culture and knowledge on the land. And we also do it through our land guardian program. And that's a way that Doig has been really engaging. And all of our land guardians are all young. And for me, that's under 30, by the way. I'm so excited. And I love the fact that a lot of them are young women. And also every member has an opportunity to come in and engage with our lands office. I think the one thing that we have not resolved is managing on and off reserve land users. And so we have some members that live not in community, and they may live in Fort St. John, or they may live in Kamloops, Kelowna, and Calgary. So how are we receiving their information, right? And how do we facilitate and support their connection to the land, their territory, when they may not have grown up or they've been displaced, through these systems, either they've been adopted or fostered out, or their family, that intergenerational impacts from day school. That's what we had at Doig, not the residential school, but the day school, but still that displacement. And so that they feel that they also have a say, right? So I don't have those answers yet. We're still working through it. That's some of the work that Doig is thinking about, is having youth shadow chief and council and different key positions in decision making. For me, it's very inspiring that these youth are really keen on making sure that there's good water quality, that they're going to be able to hunt moose, or trap like their parents and their grandparents did.
At the foundation of consultation and accommodation, there needs to be a deep understanding of Indigenous rights. And I think that the biggest misunderstanding within most of society is of Indigenous rights and what that means. And so I think, even if youth aren't directly in consultations or whatnot, they know the environment, they get it.
I think you're so correct. And we have decision makers in Ottawa or in Victoria that don't understand the realities of the people and their connection with the land. Because the policy is to get projects developed right now because there's a crisis. And understanding that, so how do you reconcile that with Indigenous rights? And then the other thing with rights is a responsibility. And we all have rights, but we also have a responsibility to take care of that land and to fully engage in a good way to make sure that we're caring for the land and the wildlife and those things that have always sustained Indigenous peoples and their cultural resiliency. And I think that's the value of the work that we do at DOIG, is bringing people out and coming and understanding that connection and just seeing the hurt in people's faces and how they experience we sometimes call it ecological grief. And former band councillor Gary Oker used to talk a lot about that. And they're like, why people feel like they're crazy sometimes, not crazy, but crazy making is the word he'd say. You know, it's that disconnection from the land and that peace that you find being connected, and it's part of your well-being and your identity and who you are as an Indigenous person. So for youth in particular, you know, it's a real important thing that we have to manage for the future, and how do we reconcile that? And the term right, you know, in Canada and a lot of the people that we work with, like we talk about rights, it's like a zero-sum game. Like, you know, Indigenous rights and then the non-Indigenous people, they don't have the same rights. Well, the reality is it just is what it is, you know, and it's not, and it doesn't have to be us or them. It can be a we, because all youth benefit from having a healthy landscape, right? So that everyone else can enjoy the land as well. So I find that there's more opportunities for collaboration that way.
Yeah, I have chills from everything you just said. It's really well articulated, especially the part where you mentioned with rights comes with responsibilities too. And I think that a lot of Indigenous people take that very seriously. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to Shona and Giuseppe for joining us.
Thank you for thinking of me and allowing me to spend some time with you today to share my time and story and my experience with Doig River.
Thanks for having me. It was nice chatting with you.
Thank you to Shona Nelson, Valérie Courtois, and Giuseppe Amatulli for lending your informed voices to this episode. We hope you join us next time on Inherent Rights, Informed Voices, Reclaiming Our Rights and Ourselves. Next episode is the season finale. Make sure to tune in as host Catherine MacQuarrie answers all your questions on inherent rights and self-governance with the help of experts across Canada.
Our season finale is fast approaching. If you want to ask a question and have it answered on air with our host Catherine MacQuarrie, make sure to email iriv.rfng@gmail.com. That's iriv.rfng@gmail.com, so your voice is heard.